Begin our second panel now on the theme of equity or equality. Which of the themes we're discussing, it's not totally clear, and that will become clear in the remarks you're about to hear. But I'm delighted to have Eugene McCarraher, a professor at Villanova University, Matt Petrusek, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and Jonathan Tran, professor at Baylor University. We're going to go in that order, so Eugene, take it away.
We all know the remark about equality uttered by Napoleon, not the loser at Waterloo, but George Orwell's imperious pig in Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. It's usually read as a cynical justification of the rule of Napoleon and his hench pigs over their fellow swine. But one could argue that our own righteous dismissal of its cynicism prevents us from asking some unsettling questions. Are some animals more equal than others? Isn't it simply a fact, attested to by common experience, that we human animals differ enormously among ourselves in strength, good looks, intelligence, athletic prowess, musical talent, acumen of all varieties? What do we mean by equality anyway? If we are or should be or want to be committed to some principle of human equality, what are we to make of our manifest inequalities? Here in the 21st century American empire, one common and controversial approach to answering these questions is called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our institutions, so DEI's foundational narrative goes, have been for far too long white male, unequal, and exclusive. Women, racial and sexual minorities, and other oppressed and marginalized groups have been locked out, belittled and vilified, if not demonized, beaten down and sometimes killed to maintain the lily-white purity of our structures of power. To redress this injustice and indignity, companies, universities, government agencies, and other centers of power must both affirm the ideals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and create managerial and administrative structures that ensure their everyday practice. In this way, so the story ends, we will create a just society. Now, this panel is charged with discussing equality, or is it equity? I think there's more than wordplay involved here. I'm going to open this discussion by suggesting that whatever overlap there may be between the two concepts, equality and equity do not mean quite the same thing, and that we should prefer equality for theological and political reasons. I'll contend that at least for the adherents of the Abrahamic faiths, the basis of equality is our creation in the image and likeness of God. Now, what that means in earthly, social, and political terms is, of course, in no way clear. But I want to suggest that equality has usually sounded a clarion call, not for some identical distribution of social and economic goods, but for an end to exploitation and oppression. I'll then take a brief look at the work of R.H. Tawney as an example of the Christian socialist conception of equality. Tawney's view of equality will then lead me to speculate about the shift from equality to equity in the liberal lexicon. Equity, I'll suggest, marks a move from seeing exploitation to seeing discrimination as the central issue of justice in democratic capitalist societies. The resulting erasure of class politics from the liberal political imagination, and the ascendancy of university-trained professionals, symbolic capitalists, to use Musa al-Gharbi's term, as the arbiters of political discourse. I'll conclude with a brief admonition to put the injustice and indignity of exploitation back at the center of democratic politics, arguing that this will achieve the diversity and inclusion that liberals and socialists rightly desire. Now, for Jews and Christians at least, the source and meaning of equality lies in our creation in the image and likeness of God, an ontological assertion made in the opening chapters of Genesis. One of the recurrent and resounding messages of the Jewish scriptures is that however sinful, stupid, ugly, or materially or morally impoverished, no one loses his or her status as an icon of God. All reflect God in equal measure. Wealth, station, and place of origin are irrelevant to how we should treat one another. You shall have one law for the stranger and the citizen alike, Yahweh says in Leviticus. The rich and the poor have this in common. God made them both, we're told in Proverbs. In the Christian scriptures, Jesus informs us that God makes his sun to rise on the good and the evil and sends his rain on the just and the unjust. Proclaiming the universalist, cosmopolitan, and egalitarian character of the Christian community, Paul declares in his letter to the Galatians that there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female. All are one in Christ Jesus. As outraged guardians of the Roman imperial order, such as Celsus or Julian the Apostate noted, Christians displayed a scandalous indifference to distinctions of birth, class, erudition, or refinement. In their view, if anyone could join this club, so they thought, why would anyone of taste or learning or breeding want to join? As David Bentley Hart has contended, part of the moral revolution that Christianity waged against antiquity consisted in its insistence that even the most wretched of the earth bore the imago Dei. Perhaps the fullest articulation of Christian equality among ancient historians came from Gregory of Nyssa in his On the Formation of Man, one of the earliest treatises on theological anthropology. The equality of all human beings in the sight of God was not a matter of their shared animality or sinfulness or intelligence or virtue, but rather of the rational nature with which they had been endowed by God. We are brothers and sisters on account of our diverse but harmonious expressions of the image and likeness of God. I'm quoting Gregory here. The gracious gift of likeness to God was not given to a mere section of humanity, to one individual man. No, it is a perfection that finds its way in equal measure to every member of the human race. All bear the stamp of divinity. Gregory drew two conclusions from this account of human equality. First, while he was certainly not a feminist in our contemporary ideological terms, Gregory was that rare bird among ancient and medieval theologians who asserted without any qualification or embarrassment that women bore the stamp of divinity as indelibly as men. Second, Gregory contended in a well-known 4th century homily on Ecclesiastes that slavery, tolerated and lamented by Paul, justified by Augustine as a just, if rather indiscriminate, punishment for sin. Slavery was evil, full stop. Indeed, Gregory's condemnation of slavery is one of the finest moral documents of antiquity. I mention Gregory's enlightened attitudes for the time on women and slavery because the terrestrial implications of equality in the image and likeness of God have long been a point of often bitter contention among Christians. In Paul's day, spiritual equality in Christ never implied earthly equality. There may no longer have been male or female or master or slave in Christ, but Paul still enjoins wives and slaves to submit to their husbands and masters. One could charitably attribute Paul's injunctions to this belief in an impending eschaton, in the light of which social equalities were unimportant. Still, the persistence of inequalities after the rise of Christendom, monarch over subjects, men over women, lord over slaves, over serfs, masters over slaves, indicates that a belief in equality before God never in any way suggested equality among human beings in society, at least to ancient and medieval Christians. As eloquent and forceful as it was, Gregory's indictment of slavery had no impact. It would take another 14 centuries for chattel bondage to be finally eradicated. But while Christendom preserved and even to a certain degree sacralized social inequality, it also contained the seeds of egalitarian upheaval. Among the numerous uprisings of medieval and early modern Europe, from the Brethren of the Free Spirit and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 to Thomas Müntzer and Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers, the spiritual equality announced by Paul or Gregory pressed toward an earthly denouement. During the Peasants' Revolt, John Ball famously epitomized the gospel of earthly equality when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. As Norman Cohn argued over 2 generations ago in The Pursuit of the Millennium, the modern revolutionary spirit derives in large measure from this insistence that the spiritual equality derived from our creation in the image and likeness of God must find material realization here on earth. Beginning in the 18th century, the secularization of this conviction in most forms of liberalism and socialism stems from a growing lack of faith that Christendom could or even would ever deliver us from the exploitation that ensured the persistence of social inequality. I want to note 2 things about equality, however. First, whether it was understood to rest on a religious or a secular basis, it has never meant that every person should receive exactly the same amount of goods of any kind. Whether it's the Book of Acts or Marx's critique of the Gotha program, equality has always been unequal. The early Christians may have held all things in common, but they were distributed by the apostles to each as had need. In the critique, Marx makes clear that even after the abolition of class society, inequalities will persist, justifiably. One worker is married, another is not. One has more children than another, and so on and so forth. Thus, with an equal performance of labor, and hence an equal in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal. As I often have to point out to students, from each according to ability to each according to need is precisely not a formula for equality. Second, equality has always been considered a precondition for something else: freedom from exploitation. Let's return to John Ball. While his remark about Adam delving and Eve spanning is often quoted, the next lines in the sermon go unremarked. From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. I love that, naughty. I exhort you to consider that now the time has come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty. Similarly, for Marx, the point of abolishing class is not equality, but rather liberating workers from the exploitative labor processes of capitalism. Equality has, I think, had more connotative than denotative meaning. It has meant not some impossible world of exact shares, but a world free of exploitation and injustice. Now, Ball's conviction that human beings were equals in the sight of God came together with Marx's desire to end exploitation under capitalism in the Christian socialist tradition that commenced in the 19th century. And to my mind, the best modern avatar of Christian socialism was the British historian and political philosopher R.H. Tawney, whose books exerted a major moral and intellectual influence over the Labour Party in the first half of the 20th century. From his posthumously published but still significant commonplace book, Through the Acquisitive Society and Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, to his treatise on egalitarianism, simply entitled Equality, Tawney exemplified the wisest, most humane, and most generous spirit of democratic socialism. In his commonplace book, Tawney was clear and adamant that, in the end, only religion provided a firm foundation for equality. In order to believe in human equality, Tawney contends, it is necessary to believe in God. In his view, this is true because a conviction that men and women are the image and likeness of God, unless you have this, human beings will lack any inherent dignity or value, a status independent of their brains, brawn, beauty, or productivity, and will inexorably be evaluated in terms of their utility, our utility to each other. But equality was not the summum bonum. It was the precondition for democracy, freedom, and human flourishing. The class inequality endemic to capitalism was immoral, Tawney thought, because capitalists and their managerial stewards deprived workers of the freedom to control their own working lives. Indeed, the chief moral iniquity of capitalism for Tawney was not the material precariousness and deprivation it imposed on workers, but rather the tyranny exercised by the wealthy. Quote, "The supreme evil of modern industrial society is not poverty," Tawney asserted. "It is the absence of liberty, of the opportunity for self-direction." Tawney elaborated on this point almost 20 years later in Equality. Equality, he noted, possesses more than one meaning. While we differ greatly as individuals in capacity and character, we are, quote, "equally entitled as human beings to consideration and respect." But those differences inevitably dictate differences in what we can do or receive or deserve. Quote, "Equality of provision is not identity of provision," Tawney observed. Equality of consideration and respect entailed recognition and even encouragement of the many inequalities of talent among us. A democratic socialist order would, in Tawney's view, accentuate and celebrate individual differences. Quote, "The well-being of a society is likely to be increased if it so plans its organization that, whether their powers are great or small, all its members may be equally enabled to make the best of such powers as they possess." Now, this is not equality of opportunity as understood in our capitalist meritocracies, where opportunity means the ability to compete successfully in an exploitative labor market, meaning winning the ability to determine the conditions of flourishing for those who lose. It's crucial to understand that in the Christian socialist, as in other socialist traditions, equality has always been seen as the basis for other goods: liberty, flourishing, creativity, fellowship. A lot of nonsense about socialism making people identical or giving everyone the same is dispelled once it's recalled that equality has never meant quantitatively identical distribution. And the evil against which the assertion of equality has been directed has been exploitation, not mere inequality. One of the things that makes DEI in its current form so problematic, in my view, is precisely the disappearance of exploitation as a moral and political issue, a disappearance reflected in the replacement of equality with equity. There seem to be two meanings attributed to equality in a great deal of the DEI literature. One is so compatible with traditional notions of equality that it's almost unremarkable: providing people with what they need to succeed or do their jobs or flourish. As I've said, this has always been part of the discourse of equality. But there's another meaning which seems to comport better with the conceptions of diversity and inclusion: representation of all groups in institutions, and especially in the leadership of institutions, by their proportion in the population. In this conception, discrimination becomes the chief moral evil. That is, to be excluded from education or employment or other social goods, especially on the basis of race or gender. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to observe how class, and particularly working class, has virtually disappeared from the liberal political imagination. The shift from equality to equity, and perhaps even DEI itself, marks the erasure of class and the attrition of socialism. Now, some of us on the left sometimes roll our eyes when some conservative critics of DEI say that it's a kind of surrogate for socialism. I would counter that DEI is itself a very conservative development, for it has arisen not against, but within the bureaucratic structures of corporate capitalism. Corporations, higher education, the state apparatus. One doesn't have to be a Marxist to think that all of these institutions exist either to exploit workers or to facilitate and legitimate that exploitation. I have to say the idea that universities are bastions of radicalism is simply laughable. Anyone acquainted with their donors, administrators, and students knows that the prime mission of elite American universities is to train the next generation of recruits for finance capital, techno capital, and their stewards. The shift from to representative equity reflects the meritocratic ideology of the professional managerial class, for whom diversity and inclusion means a credentialed elite whose composition matches the various differences in the wider population. DEI in its present iterations reflects the phony egalitarianism of today's neoliberal university, which looks to achieve, in Patrick Deneen's words, largely symbolic inclusion of designated disadvantaged groups into formative managerial institutions. In other words, it's a form of equality of opportunity, one of the oldest and moldiest of liberal bromides. It underwrites meritocracy, ratifies the competitive ethos, and preempts criticism of elite universities and their role in preserving inequality. From the business school, with its underpaid janitors, to the English department, with its underpaid adjuncts, the beatific vision of the neoliberal university is a techno-plutocracy, whose ruling class features proportional representation in terms of race, gender, and sexuality. Legitimating exploitation by broadening access to its command posts, the professional managerial conception of justice in terms of demographic representation obviates any need to dramatically transform the distribution of power and wealth in the United States by bureaucratizing the achievement of racial and gender justice. As Adolph Reed, Walter Ben Michaels, and others have argued, DEI in its current forms is the utopian idyll of the professional managerial class. It's the socialism of the metropolitan intelligentsia. What is to be done? He asked in not Marxist ways. Well, remind people in this age of rampant inhumanism that men and women are the image and likeness of God. And to sound old-fashioned, that means making exploitation central again to our politics. Rather than expend energy in the cause of making the exploiting classes more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, we ought to be thinking about the business of eradicating exploitation, which means thinking about which kinds of inequality matter. That's a far more difficult, but also more worthy political ambition.
Just to contextualize these remarks, I'm going to be talking about equality and its foundation on a specific kind of conception of human dignity within the biblical and natural law tradition. But the final arc would turn to solidarity as a key principle as well. I'm not going to address it because I've been asked only to talk about equality, and I'll be obedient. But just know that that's sort of the full horizon of these remarks. The question of human equality contains at least two interlocking challenges. One, how do we justify the existence of human equality per se? More specifically, what justifies us saying that human beings across time and space are not only ontologically equal in some respect, but also morally equal, and moreover, ontologically and morally equal in a way that is distinct from every other kind of being? Two, how can we coherently define human equality in a way that justifies equal treatment in some respects, say a categorical prohibition on murder, while also justifying unequal treatment in other respects, say paying different wages to individuals who have different roles in a company? The difficulty of establishing human equality per se, both ontologically and morally, is that empirically speaking, no human being is exactly equal to another human being in every respect. And that goes for everything we could possibly measure, including intellectual and psychological capacities. Indeed, even human DNA is not exactly identical in every human being in every respect. And moreover, DNA is not exclusive only to human beings. So even if we were able to coherently establish human equality based on human DNA alone, we would have to say that all beings that have DNA are also equal, not only among themselves, but also in comparison with all beings that have DNA, including us. That, among other things, would make eating morally challenging. So where then can we locate equality within human beings in a way that both justifies equal moral value among all human beings and, at the same time, restricts that equal value to human beings alone? That's the first problem. Let's assume, however, that it is indeed possible to justify a coherent account of human equality. And I think it is, including moral equality. We then run into a second problem. A reasonable practical application of the principle, all human beings are morally equal, is all human beings, therefore, should be treated equally. Not only in some respects, like prohibiting physical assault, but in every respect, like not paying people different wages, or not giving awards to some people and not to others, or not assigning people different prison sentences for different crimes. It's safe to say that embracing this form of absolutist egalitarianism would upend, and historically has upended, the social and economic order. That's the second problem. How then can we address this conundrum? The answer, I believe, lies in appealing to the biblical and natural law tradition of human dignity. Let me offer a brief definition of dignity that I believe is consonant with this tradition. Human dignity is the inherent value every human being has, simply by virtue of being human. And human here is defined as a being who is a unique unity of body and soul. So again, we could formulate the definition this way. Human dignity is the inherent value every human being has by virtue of being a unique unity of body and soul. Defined in this way, as we'll see, it's possible to conceive of dignity as both a permanent, constitutive feature of every individual and, at the same time, a potentiality that each individual is free to realize or free to fail to realize. In other words, the biblical and natural law tradition permits us to define human dignity as both ontologically fixed and also morally attained. Now, on the surface, this may sound like a total contradiction. How can something both be permanently immutable and yet also have the capacity for change? A helpful analogy, and this is an analogy that philosophers will quickly recognize, is to think of an acorn, the small seed that, under the right conditions, grows into a massive oak tree. An acorn is not the same thing as an oak tree, just as an oak tree is not the same thing as an acorn. However, the acorn, while small enough to hold between your fingers, already contains within it the full blueprint for becoming an oak tree. Sun, water, and nutrition are necessary for its growth, but apart from that, there's nothing external that the acorn needs to become the oak tree. It's already all there, inherently, from the very beginning. Likewise, in the oak tree, we see the full potential of the acorn realized. The acorn remains in the oak tree, it hasn't gone anywhere. It is now transformed into what it was always meant to be, a full, flourishing, healthy tree. In short, the acorn is the foundation and blueprint of the oak tree, and the oak tree is the realized purpose of the acorn. They are different, but inextricably connected. One, in fact, only makes sense in light of the other. Now, how does this analogy relate to human dignity? We can think of our inherent dignity as the indestructible and immutable seed of our worth as human beings. It is the fixed blueprint that defines each of us as dignified simply by virtue of being human. To be sure, our inherent dignity gives each one of us an individually distinct stamp of worth. There is and only will be one of each one of us in the history of the world. However, that worth, like different acorns in relation to different oak trees, has the same basic nature because specifically within humans, it is grounded in the human soul. which, though individuated, is ontologically the same in every single human being. We thus all have individual dignity, but the fundamental structure of that dignity does not change from person to person. The oak tree, on the other hand, is analogous to our attained dignity. It's what our inherent dignity is meant to become. It's the goal and purpose of our inherent dignity, the realization of our full potential as dignified human beings. In other words, just as an acorn is meant to become a healthy oak tree, that explains its whole reason for existing, inherent dignity is meant to become fully realized dignity, which is the same as becoming a fully flourishing, fully morally alive person. So then this question, how does inherent dignity become attained dignity? Still drawing on the acorn to oak tree analogy, we can say that the conditions for growth include the basic necessities of life. However, precisely because we are talking about beings who, unlike oak trees, are a unity of body and soul, the realization of our full potential requires an additional condition, something that separates us from every other form of life: the use of our freedom, our rational freedom. The gift of freedom is built into our inherent dignity. It is a part of who we are, part of what gives us value. However, how we choose to employ this freedom, this gift, is up to each one of us. We are free to build on our inherent dignity to help it grow into reaching its full potential, becoming the best version of who we could possibly be, or we can choose to neglect or even actively harm the potential, to act against it within our inherent dignity, and therefore end up falling short of our full moral potential. Think, for example, of the relationship each one of us has with our own bodies. All of our bodies, when they come into existence at conception, have a potentiality to them, operating according to an internal blueprint. They are growing towards becoming more fully what they are intended to be. Now, to be sure, most of this growth happens naturally and outside of our power to control it. However, at some point during the process, we become aware that we do, in fact, have freedom in relation to our body. We are free to take care of our bodies in a way that helps them to become healthy, fit, and strong, or we can act against our bodies, harming them in a way that causes them to fall short of what they otherwise could be. Now, of course, we don't have total freedom over our bodies, but we do have some freedom, and that freedom makes a substantial difference for what kind of life we lead. So too with our dignity. Similar to our bodies, which, like inherent dignity, have a permanently built-in nature to them, we are free to work with our dignity to develop its full potential. And similar to our bodies, the way we realize this potential is by making free choices in particular, that ideally lead us to ever greater levels of flourishing to the extent that it is possible. Likewise, either by neglect or by acting in ways that violate dignity, we can also freely choose to act against our built-in dignified nature, to prevent and indeed even to reverse its growth. We can choose, that is, to fall short of attaining everything we could otherwise become were we to act differently. Now, it's important to highlight that using the analogy of the body to explain dignity breaks down on this crucial point. The soul, which is the final ground of human dignity, at least within the human being, is, unlike the body, not subject to physical breakdown and decay. And so we could say that we have even more responsibility for the well-being of our souls than the well-being of our bodies, precisely because we have more freedom in relation to our souls than we do even to our bodies. Okay. Explaining how dignity is both inherent and attained forms the foundation for understanding why we should show equal respect to every person without exception, and why at the same time we have good reason to treat individuals differently depending on their actions and the kinds of people they choose to be and become. Atop this brief, but I hope at least plausible conception of human dignity, let me offer this definition of human equality. Equality is the inherent equal value that all human beings have simply by virtue of being human, independently of any other characteristic or capacity they may or may not have. It's important to add, I would say it's crucial to add, since equality is based on human dignity, it exists not only in relation to inherent dignity, but also to attained dignity. Therefore, while human beings are always equal with regards to their inherent dignity, which is fixed and uniform, they may not be equal with regards to their attained dignity, which is, in fact, variable. Now, of course, all of this can only be in rough schematic form in this context, but I do believe this conception of equality, founded on an understanding of human dignity as both permanently fixed and morally attained, addresses the problems I highlighted at the outset of these remarks. First, recognizing that human equality is grounded in human dignity, and human dignity in turn is grounded in the ontological fact that human beings, whatever else defines us, are unique unities of body and soul, establishes the foundation for being able to coherently affirm that all human beings are in fact equal and morally equal. Precisely because the soul is non-empirical, which is not to say unreal, it is not subject to the physical and psychological variations among human beings that would otherwise make it impossible to coherently claim that there is something that all human beings equally share without exception across space and time. If the human soul exists, and I believe that it does, then we can coherently affirm that all human beings are indeed equal. And of course, there are moral implications to this ontological equality, which we could summarily express in the form of the moral principle, treat everyone as inherently valuable, which means minimally, do no unnecessary harm. Unnecessary here being defined as harming another person without just cause. From this perspective, we must not only hold every human being with equal moral regard at the level of abstract belief, we must consequently treat everyone equally without exception, in the sense of adopting a categorical prohibition on harming other people without just cause. This is primarily construed as not acting, not assaulting others, not lying to them, not engaging in wanton destruction of their reputation, not in general using them only as instruments for one's own gratification, etc. There are no exceptions here. The principle of equality based on inherent dignity requires equal treatment of all human beings everywhere in this fundamental respect. Second, however, the same conception of dignity also justifies an interpretation of equality that not only permits unequal treatment, but in fact recommends, if not perhaps commands it. And it takes this basic form. Different treatment among free individuals is warranted and potentially praiseworthy to the degree to which it responds to how individuals freely choose to act for or against the realization of their own individual dignity and or the dignity of others. Individuals who choose to act in accordance with their dignity and the dignity of others should be rewarded. Individuals who act contrary to their own dignity and or the dignity of others should not be rewarded and potentially should even be sanctioned. So let me offer this brief summation of the argument up to this point. Equality is a necessary consequence of every human being having inherent inviolable dignity. To affirm the dignity of all people is to recognize that everyone deserves equal respect, period. Yet because dignity is both inherent and attained, equal respect does not necessarily entail, in fact, it won't entail treating everyone the same. Just as we are called to respect each other's dignity, we are also called to respect the freedom that individuals have by virtue of their dignity to realize their moral potential or not. Applied to the conversation surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, the theme of this conference, I would conclude by saying that a conception of equality based on human dignity as both inherent and attained happily undercuts one of the key features of DEI, namely that it is morally legitimate to treat individuals differently based on characteristics that have nothing to do with their free actions, characteristics like their skin color, ethnicity, or sexual proclivities. The dignity model, in contrast, restricts differential treatment to actions alone. Actions in particular that are related to the development of one's own dignity and the dignity of others. Moreover, by basing individual worth on empirical categories like race, ethnicity, and sexual proclivity, characteristics that by definition are not substantively equal among all human beings, DEI ideology actually destroys the very foundation of universal human equality itself. The dignity model, in contrast, preserves universal equality and all of its moral implications. There is, of course, much more to say, but I hope it is at least clear how the biblical and natural law understanding of equality, based on human dignity, not only can address the conundrums I identified at the outset of these remarks, but also how it is fundamentally different from, and I would add superior to in every way, DEI's anti-equality and anti-freedom view of humanity. Thank you.
I carry not only the regular nervousness of addressing a crowd like this, but the specific nervousness of having not only Baylor students in the room and Baylor faculty colleagues in the room, I have a few parents of Baylor freshmen in the room, including students I teach in the Honors College. So the kind of platonic worry about corrupting the youth takes on different resonance when you're talking about corrupting my youth. So I'm grateful to be here. I've thought about this conference coming into the fall as my strange fall conference. Strange in two ways. Strange in that the ambitions of this conference is to have a serious conversation about DEI. I don't think I've ever had a public, serious conversation about DEI. I exist in spaces where DEI is presumed as good or evil. There's no conversation about it. Second thing that's strange about this conference, but also what makes it also admirable, is that I think it was dreamed up prior to 13 months ago, when DEI radically shifted and the profile and presence of DEI in this country radically shifted. And we saw in the fall of last year a referendum on DEI when 3 college presidents were dragged in front of Congress and effectively were asked to give an account of DEI, and we quickly discovered the emperor has no clothes on this. I have made a living, a proverbial living over the last 5 years prosecuting a pretty intense argument against DEI, against languages of diversity and difference, about reducing people to identities and ascriptive identities, of making arguments against those making arguments about so-called whiteness, increasingly languages and discourses around anti-Christian nationalism find to be analytically unpersuasive, politically unhelpful, and so on and so forth. You can imagine how popular that made me among my fellow people of color. But it would be wrong of me to not acknowledge what's happened in the last 13 months. 13 months ago, what felt like a necessary prosecution against the case of DEI now feels like, as DEI is pretty clearly on the national ropes, it feels like it borders on bullying. And so I want to encourage that as we think about this serious conversation, we think about DEI as having failed in significant measure, but that failure opening up possibilities for conversations about what the best of DEI tried to get at, even if it missed. I'm going to say a few things about my own story, my own biography in the midst of these things. I'll say a little bit about the argument I've prosecuted against DEI, which is an argument quite familiar. Professor McCarraher already said it much more eloquently than I can. And then I'm going to say a few things about the opportunities in front of us now that the argument has been made against. So I grew up in the 1980s in America. I came to America as a war refugee from the Vietnam War. So this is the 70s and 80s. America had just prosecuted its own literal wars against 3 different Asian countries. Japan in the 40s, Korea in the 50s, and Vietnam in the 60s. I came as a war refugee from Vietnam. In other words, I came to America as a poor war refugee after America had learned to see people like me as perilous, as dangerous. And the vision of people like me as parallelists was held across the racial divides of America. I grew up at a time when racism, explicit racism, of the kind of people yelling out the window, teachers saying things in classrooms, kids picking on each other in playgrounds, where the racism was not simply, it wasn't simply accepted, it was expected. Racism was constant. And wherever I went, whether it be black people, white people, Hispanic people, whatever, everyone felt a kind of free-for-all on people like me. Growing up poor didn't help my cause because it meant moving about 14 times before I got to high school. And so the racism continued in a kind of what some sociologists call an ordinary form of violence. You can imagine my surprise when I got to university in the 1990s. And remember, the 1990s was the heyday and a heyday of this and a precursor to DEI under the auspices of what was called the political correctness movement. You can imagine my surprise when I got to university in this day and was quickly told that the racism I had experienced simply didn't count. In fact, it wasn't clear at all whether it was racism. I remember distinctly sitting in my freshman year as a senior white student told me how I ought to refer to myself as an Asian American. Vietnamese is not actually the proper term that Asian American is. That was a term I had never heard in my family or in my community, but I was to go forward knowing myself and understanding myself politically as an Asian American. Even though the experience of university and its language around diversity, equity, inclusion, including its precursors in the 1990s, was largely foreign and I thought unhelpful for people like me, I was as much committed to the radical movement and the radical freedom struggles that I got on board. I became a diversity advocate. I believed in the virtues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mostly thought, while it didn't make much room for people like me, it might make room for people who also mattered. And if I waited long enough, the virtues and benefits of it mattering might trickle down to people like me. When I got to being a professor, I also signed on very much to this kind of program. I eventually won what my university calls the Diversity Award, which we joke at our university among the very few of us people of color, it's passed around the 12 of us or so. So, the 13th year I can expect it again. I kept on believing increasingly as questions kicked around in my head about the conceptual apparatus of DEI, I kept on expecting that at some point it would give the benefits that it promised, and again, that the benefits to people like me would trickle down. I have distinct memories of conversations, including conversations around hiring, where people would peddle in language of diversity, and I knew for sure that they did not mean me. I was a minority, but just the wrong kind. At one point, and this happened, what the story I'm going to tell is a painful story, but I want you to know it's not a unique story. It's not unique to me in this instance, nor unique to Asian Americans. I was up for some job at some university where the DEI language was thick and common. And the interview seemed to be going fine until I realized in the middle of it that I was being attacked because I was the wrong kind of minority. That is, insofar as I was being held as a kind of diversity hire, I just didn't check the right boxes in terms of what counted as diversity. It was at that point I realized that the problem with the vacuity of the diversity movement is that its vacuousness, the fact that it lacks the kind of center that we need moral commitments to commit themselves to, meant that eventually what it would do is overcompensate and consume itself. And its consumptions couldn't help but be deeply personal ones. I stepped away from that thinking, well, what do I do? On the one hand, I could not tell these kinds of stories because of my commitments to the broader traditions of radical democratic politics that require these stories to remain silent. On the other hand, if I told a story, I risked another kind of problem. Those who were against DEI, I knew would quickly appropriate my story to make sure it was weaponized against the people they didn't like. This is, in some sense, the plight of the model, the so-called model American, model minority that Asian Americans are asked repeatedly to play across universities in America. So what did I do? I began to do the only thing I had been trained to do, which is to try to think and to think my way out of the present. Some people in this room, Jennifer Hurt, John Bolin, Eric Gregory, Sam Wells, I actually got Professor McCarraher's book right before a book I was working on, deeply helped me and encouraged me. They let me know that I was onto something, even though I was going to definitely be pushing uphill and thinking through this. I ended up writing a book called Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. I remember turning in the manuscript on January 6, 2021. The send button on the email to Oxford as those folks were overrunning the Capitol building. The argument that the book makes is the one Professor McCarraher has already helpfully articulated to us. That DEI, rather than a stratum of radical politics, is at the very center of neoliberal capitalism. Sometimes the way I would summarize what Professor McCarraher just said is that sometimes when people say that universities like Princeton, Yale, and Harvard are Marxist, I think to myself, if only. What I learned in writing this book, which is motivated primarily by the question, why is race the kind of thing that on the one hand groups some, divides others? What I learned to realize about it through folks like Du Bois and Baldwin and many, many others is that the divisive tactics of race, its divide and conquer strategies, are of course not accidental to it. That is in some sense what race is and has always been. The benefit of writing the book from the perspective of an Asian American is because insofar as Asian Americans did not fit within the white-black racial binary, which is largely what race is in this country, then it rendered me to the perspectival margins. And I intended to make use of those margins. I wanted to theorize race in America by thinking about it from the miner's canary of Asian American racial existence. What could be learned about race in America and the discourses around race, including DEI, that could be learned only from those margins. And so I wrote this book. The history I came to discover is the history that birthed and was coterminous with diversity, equity, inclusion. This is a history that is often forgotten or maybe too quickly and conveniently forgotten. That DEI, the movements of diversification, languages around equity, inclusion, I completely agree with my two fellow panelists that the reason equity is so rarely talked about in DEI conversations is because it sounds a lot like equality, and equality is a thick moral concept, unlike the other principal or organizing terms. The story of DEI is the emergence of a way of thinking about the political struggles that arose around the world, both in America and the UK and other parts of Europe, but also certainly in Central and South America, certainly in Southeast Asia, which explains much of the war in which I was born, the Vietnam War. These freedom struggles were struggles that raised to a society and a world is about whether policing and militarization are the best ways to respond to inexplicable, breathtaking forms of inequality and oppression. The fundamental question raised by these freedom struggles were questions that were extremely and inherently threatening because they were questions about redistribution. These were the questions put to society in the 50s and 60s, and the nature of these questions could not help but reverberate to the most basic metaphysical commitments of Western society. What happened after that is the often untold story of the birth of DEI. Remember that DEI grew up not in the 2000s, not in the 2010s or 2020s. That was the period in which DEI came to maturation, or I would even argue its point of decadence in its own self-ruinization. Rather, DEI came up in the 70s and 80s. This is also the time, coincidentally, of the growth of neoliberal capitalism, that mode of economic form of life where the government realized to survive and to prevent further 1950s and 60s questions that went down to the metaphysical core of our societies, in order to prevent that, preclude that going forward, society would need an enormous clapback and backlash by way of the government and the market getting in bed with each other, largely around financial industries and banking industries. The question for folks who were interested at some level in the freedom struggles in the 50s and 60s was how would we survive that? And what you saw across American universities, including at Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, was the embedding of a previous radical tradition under the conceptual terms of the turn to culture and the turn to language, the claiming of radical politics disconnected and unwedded now from redistribution of political economic realities. This allowed professors at those elite institutions to claim the mantle of radical politics while being completely divorced from the material consequences that would follow. This allowed us at universities to then talk about things like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as if we were being radical, rather than simply ordinarily neoliberal capitalists. If you want to see a very clear indication of this, look at the short history of affirmative action. Affirmative action initially began as an imagination within radical thinking about questions of redistribution, things like city contracts and who got access to city contracts and therefore labor, work, wages, and this kind of thing. Bakke effectively decided that would be untenable within the US system, and so made affirmative action largely a representational scheme. Notice the bait and switch. It had the radical sounding mantra, affirmative action, while really what affirmative action came to became instantiated into, as demonstrated in the Supreme Court case just a couple years back, was the very strange reality of liberal progressives defending the admissions policies of America's most elite institutions, both public and private, and claiming that as somehow radical. Very quickly, you can see how the fate of someone like me is going to fare in that, as indicated at the center of that Supreme Court decision, which of course had to do with Asian Americans. Eventually, this would consume itself because I think at the end of the day, we ended up really where we began with, which was not very much. A politics tied to representational schemes were only going to ever be that, and that's what we got from it. Now that season of our thinking and political life has largely, I hope, come to an end, how do we proceed? Most basically, I want to claim as a theologian that Christians think about these matters not in terms of the culture war mystique lines of thought that we're deeply tempted. Christians don't think about them in relationship to the world as warriors. We're not here to prosecute culture wars or wars of other kinds. We don't speak primarily in the grammar of resistance. Resistance either to oppression or exploitation or domination, or resistance to those who talk in those terms. Christians and this language and grammar of theology is not language and grammar of resistance. It is language and grammar of proclamation. We are proclaimers. We speak of God and God's victory in Christ. That commits us to an ontological picture of the world and ourselves within it, that proclaims things like justice as natural to the world because justice is natural to God, and this is God's world. If we can lean into those ontological commitments, which is our confession, then I think it opens up lines of thought, vistas of analysis, concepts that can help color how we enter into this new season. Let me end with, do I have one story? Time for one story? Okay. One way I would suggest something like this is read Angela Davis, and I just found out Angela Davis will be on campus here in just a couple of days. Read Angela Davis's essay, Women in Capitalism, which is remarkable for any number of reasons, but also because Professor Davis wrote it from prison. In there is an incredible melding of Black radical thought in relationship to an implicit natural law mode of reasoning. She does some things with nature and bodies and women's bodies that is just breathtaking. The other one would be a story I offer from a class I'm teaching in the Honors College at Baylor called Black Intellectual Traditions. In the class, what we're trying to do is to try to imagine the Black freedom struggle as continuous with the conversation of justice initiated in Athens with Plato and Socrates, and specifically the Republic, as having inherited the pre-Athenian tragedian culture. Trying to think about what justice might be if it isn't to be eternal recurrence of the same or just unending cycles of violence and vengeance. Then what we try to do is then to imagine the conversation about Black life as continuous with, in some ways, culminating that conversation. 2 weeks ago, as part of the Black intellectual tradition, I had them read some stuff from what's referred to in recent years as the tradition of Black Afro-pessimist thinking. If you know anything about Afro-pessimism, it's an argument that white racism and anti-Blackness are not simply functions of political economies, they are actually functions of white ontologized being. That is, there's something about the way whiteness conceives of itself that has to have an opposite, out of which it exacts forms of violence as what they call libidinal economy. Most of the students in my class are white, and you can imagine the objections they threw up to Afro-pessimism, as I hoped that they would. One student, however, began to practice what Sam Wells calls in some of his writing, over-accepting. This is the kind of over-accepting that I hope we think about in terms of this impasse. That rather than breaking an impasse, we might rather try to over-accept an impasse. That is, the impasse is ours. These are fissures within our own souls and hearts as a society and as persons. What one of my students did is to over-accept in the face of many of her students simply throwing up objections. What she said is, what the Afro-Pest story tells her and reminds her is a story of sin. A story sophisticated enough, a moral psychology sophisticated enough to actually make sense of the ways many of us in our sophisticated modes of sinning and repenting make our ways in the world. I thought this was a brilliant connection. She also had the wherewithal not simply to tie what the Afro-pessimists had to say about sin and anti-Blackness, but she had the wherewithal to tie it to the larger story of Christianity, which is a story we need to remember where sin is a speed bump in the story of God's redemption of all things. Once we make sin, or whatever systems we name sin, the primary actor, the primary determinant of that story, we will always end where we began. What I'm suggesting is we begin somewhere else.
Thank you all so much. I just want to note at the outset that after this panel, we're going to have a long lunch break. So we have a bit of breathing room. So we'll kind of see how much interest there is in the audience with questions. But I'm going to start with just a few. My first question is not theological, and it's for Gene and Jonathan. Both of you suggest that DEI is conservative because it doesn't challenge our global economic order, which you suggest is exploitative. So DEI does not challenge the exploitative system that we inhabit. It just wants the people atop an exploitative system to be diverse in various respects. But according to some conservative critics, DEI, while it may be conservative in the sense you describe, is not conservative in other senses. For example, it challenges rather than conserves the notion that France is primarily for the French people, Britain primarily for the British people. It challenges rather than conserves the notion that when we elevate people to positions of great influence and consequence, we should do so without regard to their immutable characteristics, lest we affront people's dignity and dangerously compromise the quality of critical institutions like hospitals, structural engineering firms, airlines. So, are these conservative critics wrong?
I'm waiting for you to take that first.
I mean, one of the worst parts, and I think this maps onto certain realities in the humanities. I mean, one part of the story about the decline and maybe demise of the humanities has to do with the rival growth of STEM and things like computer science and engineering offering jobs, and that certainly is the case and matters a great deal, especially when we think about the political economy of, say, debt structures of what our students are paying to go to universities. And that's all important about the humanities, but my guess is that another part of why the humanities is dying on the vine is because of work they've done internal to themselves, and this goes to your question, Brandon, about conservation. Part of what DEI and the discourse, that was anti, blank, was it was a discourse that would consume itself on the grammar of its own critique. It only knew one speed. In this sense, they're right. It was the speed of deconstruction, the speed of breaking down. And it had a hard time making distinctions then between friends and enemies, in some sense. And this has been rehearsed pretty well, say, in the post-critique movement in literary studies with folks like Tora Moy and Rita Feltsky and their really interesting kind of Catholic Victorian ontology in the background. But the idea is, I think the problem was something like students want to imagine a story in which they can place themselves and imagine and eke out forms of life and futures. All of these discourses is that they introduce acids that were supposed to melt away certain kinds of things, the forms of exploitation that Eugene talked about. But the nature of the acids were that they did not know where to stop. And so in that sense, they have proven to be incredibly destructive. But on the other hand, I want to say that we both need to acknowledge that, but that does not and cannot mean that the acids were not needed at all. The way the discourse goes is often something like that. This is why I think the moral psychology of Christian accounts of sin, which gets at the sophistication of our world, which very clearly distinguishes between different types of human acts, and doesn't allow us to make these Manichaean distinctions as good and evil, actually allows us to make very critical judgments. This is the kind of work. So yes, they introduce acids in the humanities that seem to go unending. But the answer to that cannot simply be to turn back the clock as if the acids weren't needed in the first place.
Yeah, I want to address the second question about conservative, criticisms of DEI as somehow occluding talent, access to education, medicine, other kinds of employment. I guess I would push back at that by saying that I think there's an implicit sort of meritocratic ideology there that I think we need to examine or re-examine. Because, about a couple of years ago, I wrote an essay in Commonweal. I might as well just, self-promote. Others have done it here this morning. In which, it's a review of Michael Sandel, The Tyranny of Merit. And I do think that merit is, again, one of those words that either bedazzle people, usually does bedazzle people, certainly our elites, I think, have been enchanted by it, so to speak. So I guess I'd ask, to re-examine what exactly we mean by merit in a lot of different areas of life.
So, second question. This is for all of you, but maybe we could start with Matt. Can a society that doesn't believe that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God believe in moral equality?
Not coherently, no. I think that was the That's what I was trying to get at with my sort of my abstract approach to the question that I was asked to talk on, is that, and this connects directly to, I think, the problem with DEI at a, let's say, an epistemic level, is that these values are taken as if they have both a kind of self-evident substantive meaning and a coherent, let's say, at least epistemic and perhaps even metaphysical foundation. And the reality is they don't. If we do want to establish moral equality as both an intelligible and meaningful category, which so much of our politics in the broadest sense depends upon, then we need to be able to point to some kind of foundational reality that's not just a sheer assertion, but has some kind of philosophical plausibility to it. And the biblical and natural law tradition has always provided that. Well, the problem is that we find ourselves now is we've done away with the biblical and natural law tradition, and yet we've kept the sort of the shells of the concepts that tradition produced. We've gutted them of their substantive meaning and stuffed it full of inane ideologies and expected things to work out. And we're seeing how they don't work out in real time. So I would say, no, it's not possible.
I would answer that question maybe somewhat differently. I would agree totally, but I would also say that believing in God doesn't necessarily mean that you believe people are equal. I would point to the gods of Greek and Roman antiquity. Certainly, as I said, one of the great moral revolutions that Christianity effected in antiquity was to assert that even the most wretched among us bear the image and likeness of God. That's certainly not a belief that was prevalent before Christianity. And I think this has to do, excuse me, I think this has to do partly with the nature of those gods. You know, we're told that we, or at least Christians at least, are told that we should be godlike. Well, the problem, of course, is it depends on what your God is like. Right? I mean, if your God is the God of love, okay. If your God is Zeus, if your God is, Odin, I think you're going to get a different model of behavior.
I would say that actually both sides of the question I have a little bit of trouble with. So the idea seems to be like, concepts of image of God provide the proper grounding for moral forms of reasoning that give us traction in the world. And if you don't have that foundation, then you can't actually have moral concepts that do work. I just think both sides of that are problematic. John Bolin teaches over here at the seminary, just had a student write a brilliant dissertation that showed the kinds of ways that image of God language, it works a little bit, this wasn't his student's language, but mine, works a little bit like an analytical shell game. That actually what we mean by image of God is highly contested, such that to presume it can be presented in an argument without itself coming under question is highly dubious. Highly doubtful whether you can do that. Rather, concepts of images of God require other concepts. And so you're going to have to convene all your concepts to get it to do the work you think it does. On the other side of it, I want to say whether folks who don't work with language of God can have thoroughgoing concepts of justice, equality, stuff like that. It's not simply that they can, they do. And to deny that seems to me to be unhelpful. I mean, part of what the Princeton Religion Department did over 30 years under the influence of Jeff Stout, connected to kind of alien thinkers like Robert Brandom, is give us thoroughgoing accounts of how moral and ethical reasoning work in highly satisfying ways. Now, do they exact the same kinds of outcomes? Of course not. They're not supposed to. But to think that only in a kind of foundationalist way can you have thoroughgoing moral lives or moral traction on important moral questions just seems to be an unhelpful suggestion to me. I'd rather ask, and And I think this is what Sam means by over-accepting, or what one of my atheist professors, radical generosity, looking for available lights wherever we can find it. I'd rather look around the moral lives that I find myself surrounded by in the world, and try to figure out where are the ways that they're finding hope, that they can put one foot in front of the other. Are there ways that they prove wanting? No more or less than the way my life becomes wanting, or a person for whom the image of God does do work. So I think the question gets to the great complexity of moral life, and I, again, suggest we lean into that complexity and allow the kind of thick work of Christian anthropology to allow for the sophistication of those things.
One final question, and then we'll go to the audience. So I don't think DEI has a problem with the idea that individuals and groups are morally equal to each other. I also don't think DEI has a problem with the idea that individuals are empirically not equal to each other. But I do think DEI, and really our society, has a lot of aversion to the idea that groups are empirically unequal to each other. And I guess the question is, what is the proper way to think about that last issue of group empirical inequality? What's the right way to address it, to think about it from a philosophical or theological perspective, or just from your own perspective?
One of the things I found really helpful about Gene's analysis about thinking about inequality as something like the freedom to not be exploited is it reminds me of J.L. Austin's account of truth. Remember, Austin says in the essay titled Truth, truth is a word where the negative wears the pants. What we usually mean by truth is not some metaphysical substance. What we mean by truth is not false or not wrong. I like Gene's because it has the thickness of recognizing that when we talk about equality, what we mean is often the opposite, the counterfactual. I find that this kind of thing, part of its philosophical attraction to me, Gene's account there, is that it has a kind of wide berth. Many people can acknowledge something like that. It's actually quite similar to what Jeff Stout said. A democracy is a society where you don't have to beg for things. You think through the negative, but it's a pretty helpful way to think about in a world where people were and are begging for things. So I'm attracted to that version of things.
Well, what he said. I guess the only thing I'd add is that it seems that, you talk about the American aversion to thinking about groups as being unequal. I mean, I don't know anything except I don't know as a historian any other way but to try to show historically this is simply not true. And your own American individualism is the problem that needs to be solved here.
I take it down to at the level of critique of sort of maybe the premise of the question itself, that DEI has a coherent understanding of what an empirical category is as it relates to both groups and individuals. So when we're talking about empiricism, we're talking about what can be observed, but we have the deeper question of what the categories of observation are, right, and what the limiting principles of observation are. So how that plays out within DEI is in at least two ways. Is one, how do we define a group as a group without some sort of deeper metaphysical understanding of what constitutes unity and diversity, just in a more applied sense, like what constitutes whiteness, what constitutes being Hispanic, what constitutes being a person of color. These are categories that, in order to have meaning to them, have to have some kind of methodological consistency and methodological integrity to them. This is an example that often conservative critics will point out of DEI and sort of its expression of, when we look at group inequality, we see the whites here, we see Asians here, we see black individuals here. Well, what if we pull out, for example, those of Nigerian descent in particular, and all of a sudden that's not allowed. So what is blackness? Also the causal question is as well. So if we can set aside, so okay, we can coherently define this group as this group at an empirical level. Now we're going to ask the question of the causal relationship of inequality among these different groups. That too becomes immensely complex, especially when This comment came out yesterday, and I think it's really important to highlight when we're talking about DEI is this sort of epistemic tyranny at the heart of it. And it's this, it's to say, look, reason itself, both the use of empirical reason and the use of sort of the condition for the possibility of reason itself, let's say, the law of non-contradiction, is itself an expression of white supremacy. So if that's the starting point for an ideology, and I would say it is, overtly so, with many forms of DEI, then you've just destroyed not only all empirical categories as being meaningful, but certainly any possibility of engaging the ideology in, so let's say, a sort of a fair playing field and actually having a conversation with it. So I think it's much more radical than I think it's being seen in many contexts.
Thank you. Sorry. This could be kind of a re-articulation of Brandon's first question, so sorry if it's redundant. I, too, though, was fascinated by the number of people here who have, well, two, I guess, in this panel, who have claimed that DEI is fundamentally conservative, by which you mean people have something that some interest that they're protecting, and some aspect of the status quo is being protected. So, to me, it seems that DEI it may be insincere, it may be performative, it may be shallow and ineffectual, but in its language and paradigms and ostensible social goals, it seems to be that it's very clearly and identifiably leftist, right? And I think the way that conservatives, in the sense of people committed to some kind of conservative intellectual tradition, people with strong traditional basis, and moving towards the political right, I guess we could put that there, tend to feel when we bring our concerns into the conversation, they're mostly dismissed, mocked, we're shown the door, etc. So if we're in agreement that it's time to move on from DEI, people from that kind of tradition are going to tend to say, great, can we be a more robust part of this conversation now? Can our concerns be a little bit more thoroughly aired when we discuss our social goals? So I guess I'm just fascinated to know, does it not seem to you to be the case that DEI, at least in its cast, even if it's not sincere, is fundamentally leftist?
No. And I'll tell you why. Because, first of all, I think that a lot of leftist language since the 60s has been hijacked for any number of causes. The word revolution, for example, is hardly worth saying anymore, because we have revolutions in coffee drinking now. We have revolutions in the way we squeeze oranges. I think a lot of leftist language has been appropriated, in fact, by the right or by centrists. So yeah, the language might sound leftist, but in substance, I don't buy it.
I'd actually distinguish, take some distance from the claim that that DEI is an expression. It comes from the neoliberal sort of capitalist order. I certainly find it compelling to think that the neoliberal capitalist order, sort of, let's just assuming that statement, we have some kind of understanding of what it is, has sort of used DEI as a moral cover, sort of having a moral veneer to pursue its ends. But I think, again, speaking empirically, we see that corporations that have adopted these values act in ways that aren't consistent with that thesis, that DEI sort of comes from within that very framework of value. I think we see that simply in the fact that many institutions, including corporations, would rather burn themselves to the ground than admit that sort of these values are problematic and at odds with making a profit. I think we've seen many examples of that. Oftentimes joke with my colleagues and friends, you remember the good old days when greed and the desire for power had really helpful explanatory power. I don't think we see that in a lot of corporations' behaviors and in other institutions' behaviors. Even if we grant that perhaps there is a close affiliation between DEI and sort of corporate capitalist values, I think October 7th really changed that. Even if that's the case, it created a monster now that has completely gotten out of control and is no longer able to be contained by those same corporate structures. So I would just offer those critiques of that position.
I would want to ask you something like this. Suppose the answer is yes. Those people saying those things, they say their thing, and it's often, as you said, a kind of performative gesture, and then we identify them as leftists. I'm wondering politically, what does that achieve? Other than to identify them politically, it seems to suggest it gives us some kind of way to go forward that distinguishes the world in terms of kind of these categories. What I think is important about your question was the last point, which is, or the last part of it, which was something like you pictured a scenario where, say, white people are in a room and they're told that they have nothing but evil to offer, and then a history of evil is then rehearsed. Does that paint a political future where white people are marginalized or sidelined or simply parroted as, expressions of justice or what have you? I think that part is right. That part I'm really interested in thinking through. The problem with whiteness language, right, that was, I think, the precursor to the current anti-Christian nationalism language, is that it seemed to do something ironic, especially from the perspective of the black radical tradition, which was telling white people they were possessed of whiteness as a kind of metaphysical essence or natural category. Seemed to tell people what some white people already believed. That is, the most important thing about them is that they're white, which in my mind is not something we want to keep on telling people. Rather, there's all kinds of things that are important about people, different properties and features. One great, extraordinary achievement of what I think is a certain kind of political economic reality is the evacuation of concepts of class in this country, which is now being returning in kinds of interesting ways. But yeah, I mean, the problem with telling white people that they have nothing to offer is that it's just, again, analytically unhelpful, but politically disastrous, it seems to me. Notice, for example, the people I named as huge mentors and champions of mine, they're all white people. I began my relationships with them as they only had evil to contribute, and I would not be in a position to receive the many contributions. So I want to over-accept the second part of the question, which is this question, like, how do we imagine our common life with each other? Professor Parnham talked about in Allen's book, Life with Strangers, talking to strangers. But I want to resist the idea that the way we get into that is by naming this person as leftist or opposite or something like that. I think there's ways in which that can be helpful, but we also have to acknowledge the ways that doing that are also can prove quite unhelpful.
Okay, we're going to do two more questions, beginning with Josh Hochschild.
Thank you, all three of you, for your presentations. This is a question for Matthew. In your account of the basis of equality and equal treatment in dignity and differentiating two different kinds of dignity, which overall I found very helpful, it did seem to me like there was a tendency at a certain point towards what I think of as an overly individualistic view. And it came out in a comment. I'm probably going to, I'm paraphrasing, but if you didn't mean it, it could have been heard as if you were saying the only basis for differential treatment of people is acts that those people have chosen. And it seems to me that there are unchosen features of people that have moral relevance to the way we treat them, that there can be unmerited, there can be merit that wasn't earned by their actions. There can even be demerit or some sort of fault that could be unearned by their actions. I mean, I think I should treat my kids differently than strangers. We make a distinction between citizens and non-citizens. We think if there is an oppressed group that maybe we need to respond to that in a way that it's not because of any one action that any of them did, right? So at least it seems to me that there are passions or things that have been received that are morally relevant to treating people differently, and I just wonder how you would accommodate that in your account of dignity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I prefaced my remarks saying the finality or the full circle of dignity, equality is solidarity. And so solidarity, I think, can address those concerns. One very brief way of putting it is the additional category that demands moral attention is a need. Need, unlike all the other ways that we might be able to divide up humanity in terms of ethnicity or race or even, I think there might actually be a distinction between male and female that actually does require a different kind of conversation. But setting that aside, we all are unified by either being in need or potentially being in need. And so that opens up a universal category, a universal moral category that requires us to address needs. Now then we have to add, sort of circles of proximity and calculate, how likely it is that we're able to meet, for example, the needs of the distant neighbors. But at least the category is there. And to sort of draw a full circle, the biblical and natural law tradition, specifically the Catholic social thought tradition, would argue that the condition for the possibility of fully realizing your individual dignity demands, as a necessity, not as an add-on, but as a necessity, not only being just, but being invested in helping those around you to fulfill their own dignity as well, which concretely can mean just addressing their needs. So that would be the finality of the two, to inoculate against any kind of libertarianism or even classical liberal interpretation. It's radically different in the Catholic social thought tradition from either one of those.
Thank you to all of you for some really stimulating talks. So I want to start with, I think the main critique of DEI, I understand very well. I have seen from the inside some of the horrors that it can, wreak. But let's just say we, completely get rid of it. It is, in fact, going. I am wondering, is the essence of the problem that, let's say, college admissions, since we're at a college, is the essence of the problem that different aspects of individuals, like their race or ethnicity or their gender, are noted and taken into consideration? Is that the essence of the problem, or is the essence of the problem a radical reduction, assuming that if we know a person's race or gender or so on, then we kind of know what we're going to get? Is the essence of the problem the radical reduction? Is the essence of the problem taking note at all of these differences? And I ask this because I'm wondering how you would respond to the idea that perhaps the mission of an organization is also important to thinking about whether or not we should or shouldn't take note of these differences. So if the mission, say, is to train the next generation of leaders, might we want some kind of diversity? Would that mean that we do need to look at these different characteristics? I think in terms of the fact that so many of our colleges now are scrambling to admit men, right? So there's this kind of gender imbalance where it's so female that there is a concern to look to gender to make sure that we're getting enough men. So is that a problem because now we're looking at gender in a particular way and maybe we're making assumptions? I don't know. I'm wondering, what's the essence of the problem? Is it the radical reduction in the assumption that once we see the checked box that we're assuming what's going to come with it? Or is the essence of the problem looking at those differences to kind of fill out our community in and of itself?
Yeah, I really like this question, and it actually ties to the previous question, which I take to be a question about, say, philosophy of action and how we understand human action. So the essay and the question Professor Parnham is asking is something like, what's the essence of the problem? I would just turn it around slightly and say, what's the essence of the opportunities in front of us now that that regime has kind of shown itself to be wanting? And so the dynamics that you're talking about seem to me to be vitally important to institutions. And I think that there's probably some consensus that that some of those goods are genuinely good. Placed in certain institutional apparatuses, they just went bad. But what was important about them. So the Angela Davis essay I talked about is this really interesting essay where she tries to imagine the natural between two kinds of points of reference. One is the kind of naturalizing move of ideologies of oppression that say women, because they're naturally this, can only do these kinds of things or should be subject to these kinds of unfreedoms and stuff like that. And she's pretty clearly against that form of naturalizing as a kind of ideological move. On the other side, she talks about the denuding of nature altogether in radical capitalism, which is, I don't care, if the first is to reduce you simply to your gender or race, the second one is to completely obviate consideration of difference altogether. And she wants neither. She doesn't want us to get rid of nature, but neither does she want nature to be a kind of determinative essentialism of the kind of fact. I think why I point to the Davis essay is it seems to be radically important to ask that question. What do we do with these differences that we deem to be good, but the way that we tend to carry them, speak about them, institutionalize them, tends to make for bad outcomes? The failures of DEI, to me, are an opportunity to raise this question. I think that's what Angela Davis was asking. That's what I hear you asking. Similar to Stuart Hall and his great essay on race and articulation, what Hall is saying is something like, race as a category does these things. These things are not good. And yet people lived race lives. They lived them. And to deny, this goes back to the previous question about the individuality of a certain philosophy of action, to deny those realities doesn't do us any good either. The question for our society is whether we will have the moral capacity to take it to our breast and hold both at once. That people express and live differences, but those differences can't be reduced to those differences. In this way, we're going to have a much more radically capacious life with people. That's why I worry about, if I understand this person as a leftist, somehow I understand them. Rather, we need to have kind of political lives with people that allow the full array of who they are to be expressed, including the differences that are determinative of their lives in very critical ways that deeply affect institutions. Whether we as a society are capable of this, of course, is the open question.
Okay, please join me in thanking our presenter.